Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We talk a lot on the show about organizations needing to constantly up their game, right? Making sure they're meeting all those essential standards and requirements.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a never-ending process.
And a big part of that continuous improvement, it all comes down to auditing their management systems. Think of it as like a comprehensive health check for their entire operation.
Exactly. Auditing is key to making sure things are running smoothly and efficiently.
And today, we're going deep, really deep, into a resource that can give you some serious insider knowledge about how these audits actually work.
Oh, this is good stuff, folks. We're talking about Annex A of ISO 1911.2018.
Now, you might be thinking Annex A, that sounds, well, a little dry.
Maybe a bit, but trust me, this thing's a gold mine of practical tips and tricks.
Seriously, it's where the real magic happens. Think of ISO 1911 as the ultimate guidebook for auditing management systems, right?
Right. The main part of the standard lays out all the core principles and guidelines. That's like your auditing 101.
Exactly. But then you get to Annex A, and it's like, bam! You've unlocked the advanced level.
It's full of insider advice to help you make your audits not just, by the book compliant, but truly effective. And let's be honest, no one wants to waste time on audits that don't actually make a difference.
Totally agree. That's why we're dedicating this entire deep dive to really unpacking Annex A, section by section. We'll be your guides, kind of like a couple of instructors walking you through all the key insights.
Whether you're the one planning an audit, participating in one, or just curious about how organizations make sure they're on the right track, this deep dive's for you.
So buckle up. Let's kick things off by looking at how many different ways you can actually do an audit. It's not as simple as you might think.
Oh, it's definitely not one size fits all. And Annex A makes that super clear right from the start.
Yeah. Auditing has evolved way beyond just someone showing up with a checklist and a clipboard.
Gone are those days. There are so many tools and techniques auditors can use now.
And the really smart approach, mixing and matching those methods to fit each situation perfectly.
Absolutely. It's about being strategic and adapting to the specific needs of the audit.
To help us navigate all this variety, Annex A breaks down the different methods based on two key factors. First, how much interaction there is between the auditor and the person being audited. Are they having a face-to-face conversation, or is it more of an independent review?
Makes sense. That level of interaction can definitely change the whole dynamic of the audit.
And second, where is the auditor actually located? Are they on-site at the organization, or are they doing the audit remotely?
The location question. That opens up a whole world of possibilities, especially with all the technology we have now.
Totally. So if you consider these two factors together, it creates four distinct scenarios.
Like different quadrants of auditing, right? Each with its own unique characteristics.
Exactly. So let's walk through some examples in each of these quadrants. First up, on-site auditing with lots of human interaction.
All right, picture this. You're the auditor, you're on site at the organization, and you're sitting down with an employee, having a conversation, really digging into their processes and procedures.
That's classic on-site auditing. You're conducting interviews, getting those first-hand insights.
Right. And you might also be reviewing documents together, maybe going through a checklist side by side.
And then there's sampling. You select specific records or items to take a closer look at, and you talk about them with the relevant folks.
So it's all about that direct, real-time back and forth between the auditor and the auditee.
Now let's move on to our next scenario. Still on site, but this time with less of that direct human interaction.
So in this case, the auditor is on site, but they might be spending more time independently reviewing records, analyzing data, or observing work being done without immediately jumping in with questions.
Yeah. They might be doing a walkthrough of the facilities, checking things out firsthand.
Maybe they're completing checklists based on their own observations or taking product samples to analyze later.
It's still on site, but it's more about gathering information independently.
All right, let's switch gears to the world of remote auditing. First up, remote auditing with human interaction.
So now we're talking about those virtual audits where the auditor isn't physically present at the organization's location.
But they're still interacting with people. It's just happening through video calls, screen sharing, and online platforms.
Exactly. Think about those virtual interviews where you're connecting with people remotely and asking them questions about their work.
Or maybe you're observing a process remotely, with someone on site acting as your guide, using a camera to show you around.
You might even be working through a checklist together collaboratively using screen sharing tools.
So it's all about leveraging technology to maintain that human connection and gather information remotely.
Now for our final quadrant. Remote auditing with no direct human interaction.
So in this case, the auditor is working entirely remotely, accessing data and information electronically.
They might be reviewing records that have been shared online, analyzing data sets, or even observing work through security camera footage.
It's all about using technology to gather and analyze information from a distance, without that real-time back and forth with the auditee.
It's pretty amazing how technology has expanded the possibilities for auditing.
It really has. And what's really insightful here is that Annex A emphasizes the best approach usually involves using a mix of these methods.
Yeah, it's not about picking just one and sticking with it.
Exactly. For a truly comprehensive audit, you want to strategically combine on-site and remote methods with varying levels of human interaction.
That makes total sense.
Right.
For example, you might start an audit program by doing some remote document review to get a general understanding, and then follow that up with targeted on-site interviews to dig deeper into specific areas.
Absolutely. It's about using the right tools for the right job. Now, the next question is, who decides which methods to use in the first place? Who's calling the shots?
It's a team effort, but ultimately, the audit program manager is responsible for setting the overall strategy.
Right, during the planning stages, they're thinking about the big picture. What are the audit objectives? What mix of methods will be most effective?
But then, when it comes to the actual execution of the audit team leader has a lot of flexibility to decide which specific methods to use on the ground.
So they can adapt to the situation as needed, right?
Exactly. And before we move on from this topic of audit methods, there's one more thing that Annex A touches on that's worth mentioning.
Oh yeah, this is an important one. It's about whether remote audits are actually the right choice in every situation.
Right. Because sometimes being physically present at the organization is simply essential.
And Annex A highlights some key factors to consider when you're deciding whether a remote audit is feasible.
The biggest one, I think, is the level of risk involved. If there's something critical that you absolutely need to see with your own eyes, you can't rely on a remote audit.
No, you can't. And the relationship between the auditors and the auditee is also crucial. Remote auditing requires a higher degree of trust and clear communication.
Definitely. And of course, there are often specific regulations that dictate whether an on-site audit is required. You can't just ignore those.
So it's all about carefully evaluating those factors and choosing the approach that best suits the specific circumstances.
All right, let's shift gears now and move on to the next big idea highlighted in Annex A, the process approach to auditing. This is a term you hear a lot in the ISO world.
It's everywhere, and for good reason. It's a fundamental principle in how ISO management system standards are designed.
Annex A reminds us that when you're auditing, you shouldn't just be going through a checklist and ticking boxes.
It's so much more than that. The real value comes from understanding the organization's processes, how they actually do their work, how different processes connect, and how it all contributes to their goals.
So instead of asking, do you have a written procedure for this, you're more interested in seeing how things actually happen in practice.
Right, who's involved at each step? What resources are they using? What's the intended outcome? It's about seeing the big picture, not just isolated tasks.
And the core idea behind the process approach is that when an organization manages its activities as a network of interconnected processes, that's when they achieve consistent, predictable results.
It's about creating a system that works seamlessly, not just a bunch of separate procedures.
Okay, process thinking in auditing, check. The next section in Annex A is all about professional judgment. And this is where the human element really comes into play.
It's where the auditor's experience and expertise truly shine.
Standards are important, they provide a framework, but auditing isn't just about mechanically checking off boxes.
Definitely not. Auditors need to use their critical thinking skills, their knowledge of the industry, and their understanding of the organization's context to make informed decisions.
Annex A specifically points out that sometimes you have to determine if the intent of a requirement is being met, even if the organization doesn't have a formal procedure for it.
Right, because sometimes organizations find creative ways to achieve the desired outcome, even if they haven't documented every single step.
So you have to look beyond just the procedures and assess whether they're actually achieving what the standard is trying to accomplish.
It's about seeing the forest for the trees, using your judgment to determine whether their approach is effective.
Now, Annex A takes this idea of looking beyond procedures a step further and emphasizes the importance of focusing on performance results.
This is all about asking the big question, is this management system actually working?
Right, because an organization might have beautiful procedures, meticulously documented, But if those procedures aren't actually leading to the desired outcomes,
Then what's the point, right?
exactly. Annex A highlights that the real measure of a management system's success is its actual performance. Are they achieving their objectives? Are they seeing improvement?
It's about looking at the results, the tangible impacts of the
And
system.
if they're not seeing those positive outcomes, then that's a major area for the audit to focus on.
Absolutely. And another important point Annex A makes is that when an organization has multiple management systems in place, say for quality, environment, health, and safety, you have to look at how those systems integrate.
Right, because they shouldn't be operating in silos.
Exactly. You have to evaluate their combined performance and how they contribute to the organization's overall success.
Annex A also makes the point that sometimes not having a specific procedure or document isn't necessarily a deal breaker. It depends on the organization, right?
It does. For a large, complex organization in a high-risk industry, the lack of a formal procedure might be a red flag.
But in a smaller, less complex setting, it might be perfectly fine if they're achieving the intended outcome through other means.
Maybe they rely on informal communication or the expertise of their staff. It's about using your judgment to determine what's appropriate for that specific organization.
Okay, we're getting a really good understanding of the auditor mindset here. The next topic in Annex A is verifying information, and it even gives us a handy little memory tool for this, the CCCC acronym.
Yes, the 4 Cs. It's a brilliant way to remember the key things to consider when you're assessing the information you gather during an audit.
Complete, correct, consistent, and current. Think of it as your mental checklist for evaluating the reliability of audit evidence.
Exactly. So let's break those down one by one.
Starting with complete, what are we looking for here?
You're asking, does the information provided contain everything you would expect to find?
Given the requirements of the standard and the organization's activities.
Exactly. Are there any gaps in the information? Any missing pieces of the puzzle?
Next up, correct. What's that all about?
Here, you're checking if the information is factually accurate. Does it line up with other reliable sources?
Things like the management system standards themselves, relevant regulations, industry best practices, or even the organization's own internal data.
You're looking for consistency with those trusted sources of information.
Now for consistent, what does that mean in the context of verifying information?
This is about checking for internal consistency. Does the information within a single document make sense? Does it contradict itself?
And you're also checking if it's consistent with other related documents and information within the organization.
Right. Are different departments using conflicting information? Are there any discrepancies that need to be addressed?
And last but not least, current. This one seems pretty straightforward.
It is. It's about making sure the information is up to date. Does it reflect the organization's current processes, the latest versions of standards, any recent changes?
Outdated information can lead to all sorts of problems, so this one's crucial.
Absolutely. Annex A also mentions something really important about verifying information, assessing the integrity of evidence that might be presented in an unexpected way.
What does that mean for us as auditors?
Sometimes you get information that doesn't come in a neat and tidy package.
It might be from an unusual source, or in a format you haven't seen before.
In those cases, you need to use your critical thinking skills to evaluate its reliability.
So don't just dismiss it out of hand because it's different, but don't accept it blindly either.
Exactly. And in today's digital world, Annex A rightly reminds us about information security during audits.
Especially when you're accessing electronic documents and systems, you have to be extra careful.
You need to make sure you're not accessing information that's outside the scope of the audit.
Or information that could be sensitive or confidential.
Absolutely. It's about being a responsible and ethical auditor.
All right, on to the next topic. Sampling. This one can sometimes feel a little intimidating, but Annex A provides a lot of helpful guidance.
Sampling is a crucial part of auditing, especially when you're dealing with large amounts of data or complex processes.
You can't always look at every single piece of information. So sampling is about selecting a portion of the data to draw conclusions about the whole.
And the first thing Annex A points out about sampling is that there's always a risk involved.
Because you're not looking at everything, there's a chance that your sample might not perfectly represent the whole picture.
Right, you could miss something important or overemphasize a problem that isn't actually widespread.
So how do we as auditors approach this challenge of sampling? Annex A outlines some typical steps to follow.
First, you define your objectives. What are you trying to learn from this sample?
Then you determine the population you're sampling from. What's the pool of data or activities you're looking at?
Next, you choose a sampling method and determine your sample size.
And after conducting the sampling, you analyze the results and document your findings.
And one thing that Annex A really emphasizes is that the quality of the data you're sampling from is critical.
If the data itself is flawed or incomplete, your sampling results won't be reliable, no matter how well you conduct the sampling.
So you need to make sure you're starting with good quality data.
Now, Annex A breaks down sampling into two main categories: judgment-based sampling and statistical sampling.
Judgment-based sampling, as the name implies, relies heavily on the auditor's experience and expertise.
They use their knowledge of the organization and the processes to select a sample that they believe will provide the most relevant information.
It's about making informed decisions based on your professional judgment.
So it's more targeted and flexible.
Exactly. But the downside is that you can't statistically estimate the uncertainty in your findings.
It's based on the auditor's expertise, not on hard numbers.
Right. Now, statistical sampling, on the other hand, uses probability theory to select the sample.
This allows for a more objective approach, and it gives you a way to estimate the characteristics of the whole population based on the sample.
And there are two main types of statistical sampling. Attribute-based sampling, which is used when you're evaluating a characteristic with only two possible outcomes, like pass or fail.
And variable-based sampling, where the characteristic you're measuring falls on a continuous scale, like a temperature reading.
Exactly. Annex A points out a bunch of factors that can influence the design of a statistical sampling plan. Things like the audit objectives, the number of auditors available, the frequency of audits, any requirements for confidence levels, and the historical occurrence of any problems.
And it also mentions the concepts of acceptable confidence level and sampling risk.
These are essential to understand when you're using statistical sampling. The sampling risk is the probability that your sample doesn't accurately reflect the whole population.
And the acceptable confidence level is how certain you want to be that your sample-based conclusions are accurate.
So if you set a 5% sampling risk, you're accepting a 5% chance that your sample might be misleading.
Which means you have a 95% confidence level. You're 95% sure that your sample is representative.
And when you're using statistical sampling, Annex A is very clear about the importance of documentation.
Every step of the process needs to be thoroughly documented.
This ensures transparency, allows for review, and makes it possible to replicate the sampling if needed.
All right, now let's move on to another critical area of auditing: compliance.
Making sure the organization is meeting all those statutory, regulatory, and other requirements.
Annex A advises auditors to assess whether the organization has processes in place to identify, manage, and evaluate their compliance.
So it's not enough to just have a list of applicable laws. They have to show they're actively working to comply with them.
And they need to be regularly checking their compliance status.
Annex A even provides a list of specific things auditors should consider when evaluating compliance.
For example, do they have a process for tracking changes in requirements? Are the people responsible for compliance competent? Do they have documented evidence of their compliance status?
And compliance shouldn't be treated as a separate activity. It needs to be integrated into the management system.
It should be part of their internal audits and management reviews.
Absolutely. It's about making compliance a core part of how they operate.
Next up, Annex A talks about auditing context. This has become increasingly important in management system standards.
Understanding the organization's context, their internal and external environment, the needs and expectations of interested parties is crucial for building an effective management system.
And auditors need to confirm that the organization has a good grasp of their context.
Right. And Annex A gives some specific examples of objective evidence you can look for.
You want to see their process for determining their context.
Are they using appropriate tools and methods? Are the people involved competent? What did they identify as their key internal and external issues?
And most importantly, how did they use that information to define the scope of their management system?
And did they review and update their context analysis periodically? Because things change, it's not static.
It's all about making sure they're not just going through the motions, but actually using their context understanding to inform their decisions.
Exactly. Annex A also mentions the importance of auditors having sector-specific knowledge.
Because different industries and sectors use different tools and approaches for analyzing their context.
So you, as the auditor, need to understand those nuances to properly evaluate their approach.
Moving on to another key area: leadership and commitment.
This reflects the growing emphasis in management system standards on the vital role that top management plays.
It's not just about signing a policy document, it's about demonstrating leadership and commitment in everything they do.
And auditors are tasked with finding evidence of that commitment.
You can look at the organization's policies, objectives, resource allocation, and how they communicate about the management system.
But talking to staff at different levels can give you really valuable insights. Do they feel that leadership genuinely supports the management system?
And Annex A specifically suggests interviewing top management themselves.
To make sure they have a deep understanding of the issues and the organizational context.
They need to be able to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
And another point that Annex A makes is that leadership and commitment aren't just top management's responsibility.
Everyone at every level needs to be engaged and committed to the management system for it to be truly effective.
Absolutely. It's a cultural thing, not just a leadership thing.
Okay, next up is risks and opportunities. This ties in closely with context and performance, right?
It does. A lot of modern standards require organizations to actively identify and manage risks and opportunities.
And as an auditor, you need to check if their process for doing that is credible and effective.
You're looking to see if they're properly identifying risks and opportunities, managing them effectively, and regularly reviewing their approach.
And Annex A makes it clear that this isn't something you audit in isolation. It should be integrated throughout the audit process.
It should be a lens through which you view every aspect of the management system.
You gather objective evidence by looking at the inputs they use to identify risks and opportunities, their methods for evaluating those risks and opportunities, and how they address them.
And their approach can vary depending on their industry and specific circumstances.
So as an auditor, you need to use your professional judgment to assess if their method is appropriate and effective.
And you want to look at their risk appetite. How much risk are they willing to tolerate? And the controls they have in place to mitigate those risks.
Now, Annex A also talks about life cycle, which is a term that some people might not be familiar with in the context of management systems.
Some standards require organizations to consider the entire life cycle of their products or services.
From raw materials to production, use, and end of life.
It's about understanding the potential impacts at each stage.
And identifying opportunities to minimize negative impacts and enhance positive ones.
As an auditor, you need to assess how they're applying this life cycle thinking.
Looking at the lifespan of their products, their influence over the supply chain, and the technological complexities.
And if they have multiple integrated management systems, you need to check for overlaps and inconsistencies.
To make sure they're taking a consistent approach across all systems.
Next up, Annex A touches on supply chain audits.
This is becoming increasingly important as organizations rely more and more on external suppliers.
Annex A suggests that supplier audits might be necessary to ensure they meet your requirements.
The scope of these audits can vary. It might be a full system audit or focus on a specific process or product.
It's about making sure your suppliers are meeting the standards you need them to meet.
Because their performance can directly impact your organization's ability to achieve its own objectives.
We're almost through Annex A now. The next section is about preparing audit work documents.
Might not sound glamorous, but well-prepared documents are essential for a smooth audit.
Think of them as your roadmap for the audit.
Annex A encourages you to think carefully about each document you use. What purpose does it serve? Who will use it? What information do you need to prepare it effectively?
And for combined audits, where you're auditing against multiple standards, it's crucial to avoid duplication in your documents.
You don't want to be asking the auditee the same questions over and over again.
And your work documents can be in any format that works for you, paper, electronic, whatever's most efficient.
The next section is all about selecting sources of information.
It's not just about interviews. There are so many other places you can gather evidence.
Annex A lists a whole bunch of potential sources, including interviews, observations, documents, records, data summaries, sampling plans, reports from external sources, databases, even simulations and models.
It's about using a combination of sources to get a comprehensive understanding of the organization and its management system.
Now, for a section that's particularly relevant in today's world, visiting the auditee's location. This covers both traditional on-site visits and virtual visits.
For on-site visits, Annex A gives guidance on planning the visit, conducting the on-site activities, and some specific considerations for virtual activities that might happen during an on-site audit.
Planning is all about the logistics, like permissions, safety procedures, PPE, protocols for using devices and cameras.
You want to make sure you have everything in place for a smooth and safe visit.
And during the visit itself, it's important to minimize disruption, use PPE properly, be aware of emergency procedures, communicate effectively, and never touch any equipment without permission.
And you need to know how to handle any incidents that might occur. Always ask for permission before copying documents, and avoid collecting unnecessary personal information.
Annex A also highlights some key things to keep in mind for virtual activities that might take place even during an on-site audit.
Like having agreed upon remote access protocols, doing technical checks beforehand, having backup plans, using visual aids like floor plans, facilitating the sessions to minimize disruptions, always asking permission before recording anything, and ensuring privacy during breaks.
It's all about being respectful and professional, whether you're there in person or virtually.
Now, Annex A also has a dedicated section on auditing virtual activities and locations.
This is distinct from simply conducting an audit remotely. It's specifically about auditing online environments.
Like reviewing documents in a shared cloud platform or examining records in an internal database.
And Annex A emphasizes that while these virtual audits still follow the same basic process, they heavily rely on technology.
So you need to have the technical skills to navigate those environments and the ability to gather information effectively in a virtual setting.
And you need to be mindful of things like security risks, using visual aids to stay oriented, preventing disruptions, asking for permission before recording, and ensuring confidentiality during breaks.
Just like with on-site audits, it's about adapting your approach to the specific environment.
And the final topic in Annex A is conducting interviews, which is still a primary way of gathering information in audits.
Annex A gives some great tips for making those interviews as effective as possible, whether they're in person or virtual.
Like trying to interview people in their normal work environment, putting them at ease, clearly explaining the purpose of the interview, starting by asking them to describe their work, choosing your questions carefully, being mindful of the limitations of virtual interviews, and summarizing the key points to ensure you understood correctly.
And always remember to thank them for their time.
And finally, we arrive at the last section of Annex A audit findings. This is where you evaluate the evidence and draw conclusions.
Annex A highlights several factors to consider when determining your findings. Any follow-up actions from previous audits, client requirements, the accuracy and sufficiency of evidence, whether planned activities were completed, if any findings represent opportunities for improvement, the sample size if you used sampling, and how to categorize your findings.
And for recording conformities, you should include a description or reference to the criteria met, the supporting evidence, and a declaration of conformity if required.
For nonconformities, you need a description of the criteria not met, the supporting evidence, a clear declaration of nonconformity, and any related findings.
And Annex A also addresses situations where a single observation might relate to multiple criteria, especially in combined audits.
In those cases, you can raise separate findings for each criterion, or a single combined finding that references all the relevant criteria.
And auditors can provide guidance to the auditee on how to respond to those findings.
Well, that was quite a journey through Annex A of ISO 19011. It's packed with practical guidance for anyone involved in audits.
We covered a ton of ground, from different audit methods to the importance of professional judgment, focusing on performance results, verifying information, sampling techniques, and considerations for compliance, context, leadership, risks, the life cycle, supply chains, audit documents, sources of information, conducting both on-site and virtual audits and interviews, and finally, determining and reporting audit findings.
Ooh, that was a mouthful.
It was, but it was worth it. Hopefully you, our listener, now have a much deeper understanding of the practical advice in Annex A and how to apply it to your own work.
Whether you're an auditor, part of an organization being audited, or just interested in how organizations strive for improvement, Annex A has something for you.
And with that in mind, here's a final thought for you to ponder. As organizations become increasingly complex and interconnected, how will the principles and techniques in Annex A need to evolve to ensure audits remain effective and valuable?
It's a question worth thinking about. We encourage you to explore ISO 19011 and related standards to learn even more.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.
See you then.